What if the largest desert on Earth used to be a garden? Not metaphorically, literally. The Sahara was once green, lush, teeming with rivers, lakes, elephants, even crocodiles. A 5,000-year stretch known as the African Humid Period turned this barren expanse into a continent-spanning savanna. Picture the Serengeti, then double it. And humans didn't just pass through. They lived. They settled. They created. Archaeologists have found stone tools, fish hooks, polished ceramics, cattle bones, even entire cemeteries, like Gobero in Niger, where bodies were buried with grave goods, ivory bracelets, and filed teeth. Some of the oldest evidence of dairy use and pastoral herding on the planet comes from here. So here's the contradiction. A place so full of life, yet no one today seems to carry their genetic trace. We've sequenced thousands of ancient genomes, from Europe, the Levant, sub-Saharan Africa. But until recently, nothing from the heart of the Sahara. The heat, the salt, the time, it all destroys DNA. For decades, the Green Sahara remained a ghost. And that made no sense, because these people weren't nomads. They left behind entire lifeways, painted on cave walls like Takarkori and Wadi Sura, rock art showing cattle herding, swimming, dancing, lives full of routine and ritual, cultures that clearly flourished but vanished genetically. Could an entire civilization disappear without leaving a single descendant? Then a breakthrough. In a cave in southwest Libya, researchers uncovered 2 burials, women laid to rest over 7,000 years ago. But these weren't just bones. They were mummified, skin intact, organs shriveled but preserved. Against all odds, their cells still held fragments of ancient DNA. Scientists used next-gen sequencing, the same techniques used to decode Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes, to extract nearly 1 million SNPs from one of them. And what they found was unprecedented. These women didn't match modern Africans, or sub-Saharan lineages, or even Egyptian or East African genomes. They came from a lineage never seen before, an ancient North African branch, split from all others nearly 50,000 years ago. They weren't part of the story. They were the missing chapter. And as their genome unraveled, so did the idea that Green Sahara people were just migrants passing through. Because these women weren't foreign. They were local, deeply rooted, isolated, and they would shatter everything we thought we knew about African ancestry. But one question still haunted the excavation site. Why did no one inherit their DNA? The answer would take us deeper into the desert, and into the genome of a forgotten people. The question wasn't just who these women were. It was how they had survived. Not in memory, not in myth, but in matter. Skin still stretched across bone, eyelids sealed shut by sand and time. Over 7,000 years had passed, and yet their bodies hadn't turned to dust. They were found in Takarkori, a rock shelter in the Acacis Mountains of southwestern Libya. Today, it's a wasteland of cracked stone and silence. But back then, it was alive. Wet season rains carved streams through valleys. Herds of goats and cattle moved through grass. People cooked, hunted, raised children here. These women were buried with purpose. Wrapped, protected. Not tossed into the earth, placed. One hand curled near the face. A shell pendant still on her chest. And near them clues, fragments of woven baskets, tools carved from bone, ashes of a cooking hearth, and the remains of fish that no longer swim there. This was no random grave. It was a portal. For decades, researchers tried to find human DNA in the Sahara, and failed. Too dry, too hot, too exposed. Bones cracked like firewood. Nucleotides are long gone. But here, in the shelter of rock and ritual, something impossible had happened. Their DNA had survived. Not just scraps, whole strands. From one woman, nearly 1 million SNPs. The highest resolution genome ever recovered from the Central Sahara. And suddenly, for the first time in human history, we had a direct genetic window into life during the African Humid Period. They lived during the pastoral shift, that moment when ancient Saharans stopped chasing game and started raising it. The bones around them tell that story. Cattle with field horns, sheep remains, goat teeth. Yet fishhooks and grindstones speak of older ways. These women weren't just farmers or foragers. They were both, or something in between. And in their blood, Something waited. A whisper from deep time. Something older than dynasties. Older than writing. A branch of humanity long forgotten. Because when researchers fed that ancient code into the global genome map, the results didn't fit anywhere. Not Egypt. Not Nubia. Not even sub-Saharan Africa. They had found a lineage that wasn't supposed to exist. And that's when the real mystery began. Who were these women, if they weren't related to anyone? The Takarkori women didn't belong to any known African lineage. Not to the Nilotic gene pools of the Nile Valley. Not to the Bantu expansions from the south. Not even to Egypt's dynastic corridors. When their sequences were run through principal component analysis, the very map of global ancestry, the results broke the axis. Their genomes drifted alone. They formed their own cluster, floating between the West African ellipse and the Levantine curve, but merging with neither. Not Fulani, not Berber, not anything we'd seen before. Instead, something older. Their DNA held 93% ancestry from a source that wasn't just unknown, it was unmodeled. A ghost population, as geneticists call it. One that split off nearly 50,000 years ago, and then vanished from view. But it didn't vanish completely, because these women were that ghost, preserved by chance, by burial, by climate, holding in their cells the last echo of a forgotten Saharan genome. They weren't just descendants. They were survivors. And somehow, in the middle of a desert that became oceanic in heat, swept by migrations from all sides, they remained untouched. No admixture from Nilotes. None from East Africa. Not even from the Levantine herders, known to move along the Mediterranean coast. The Sahara, in this moment, wasn't a bridge, it was a wall. But what kind of wall preserves a lineage for 40,000 years? And what kind of people live behind it? Archaeologists had long thought the Sahara's greening would connect the continent, allow flows of people, language, genes. But this data told a different story. One of isolation, not exchange. Of communities that absorbed culture, but not blood. And Takarkori wasn't a marginal site. It was a genetic citadel. A last bastion of ancient North Africa before the world changed. But just when scientists thought they had found the baseline of Saharan ancestry, one final anomaly surfaced. Something buried even deeper in their DNA. Something that didn't belong there. Because these women, in all their ancient purity, carried less Neanderthal DNA than almost any population on Earth. But somehow not zero. That tiny trace, just 0.15%, was like a whisper from another world. A world far north. A world where Homo sapiens first met Neanderthals and mixed. Most non-Africans today carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. European farmers from 7,000 years ago. Even higher. But these Saharan women? They held a ghost fragment, barely there. If their genome had been found in a limestone cave in France, or a burial pit in Georgia, scientists might have called them early modern humans. A lineage too ancient, too clean, as if it had frozen in time. But they weren't European. They were African, buried in a desert cave that once overlooked a savanna. And yet, that faint Neanderthal signal meant something huge. It meant contact. Not direct, not recent, but carried. Traced through genes, not geography. It meant that somewhere, maybe 8,000 years ago, maybe more, herders from the Levant, who had interbred with Neanderthals, crossed into North Africa, possibly through the Sinai, possibly across the Mediterranean's island chains. But here's what's strange. They left no visible cultural scars. No flood of genetic mixing. Just a flicker, a whisper, a genetic brushstroke, so faint it could have been missed entirely. So these women, these Takarkori ancestors, they're a paradox. Modern, because they lived only 7,000 years ago. But ancient, because their genome looks like it stepped out of the Pleistocene. Isolated, yet globally connected by a genetic memory that had traveled continents. Their DNA isn't just rare. It's deeply divergent. When researchers ran side-by-side genetic trees, their branches barely touched others. Not sub-Saharan, not Levantine, not even taffrilled foragers from Morocco, who lived 15,000 years ago. It was like opening a time capsule, only to find a species shaped by silence. But if their blood held back the world, what about their minds? Because culture is different from DNA. Culture moves in whispers, in pottery, in painted walls, and shared songs. And what Takarkori reveals next might just prove that even the most isolated people were never truly alone, because something did arrive in the Sahara. Not armies, not migrations, not new blood, an idea. Around 8,200 years ago, climate patterns began to shift. The African humid period faltered. Rain belts weakened. Rivers shrank. Shallow lakes dried into cracked basins. A 1,000-year drought rolled in, silent, slow, and devastating. The people of Takarkori didn't vanish. They adapted. And what they turned to was animals. Cattle, goats, sheep. Domesticated species that weren't born in Africa. Genetic studies trace their origin to the Fertile Crescent, modern-day Turkey, Iran, Syria. By 6,400 BCE, they appear in Egyptian records. But here's the twist. These animals reached the Green Sahara without their original human companions. Because when scientists studied the Takarkori genomes, they found no Eurasian farmer ancestry. None of the markers from Anatolia. None of the Levantine blood that had already reshaped the Mediterranean. The people remained genetically North African, isolated, distinct, deeply rooted. And yet their livestock didn't. This wasn't migration. It was transmission. Pottery styles changed. Rock art began to show herds instead of hunts. The bones of wild gazelle declined, replaced by domestic cattle. But the DNA? It stayed almost exactly the same. This is the paradox. The people didn't move, but their culture did. And the evidence isn't abstract. It's carved into caves like Wadi Sura, drawn with ochre across Libyan rock walls, buried beside the dead in Takarkori. Clay bowls, once used for gathering roots, now carried milk. Butchers began cutting in patterns unique to herding societies. Even the bones of cattle show signs of controlled breeding. Horns filed flat, selective size. Ideas traveled farther than bloodlines. And in that, a haunting question appears. Because if knowledge could cross deserts, if animals, tools, and techniques could leap from one world to another, then why didn't people follow? Why didn't the sub-Saharan world pour into this green oasis? Why didn't the Mediterranean rush southward? Why, in a land so lush it mirrored Eden, did only silence surround these people? And the answer to that might lie not in what they carried, but in what they refused to let in. Maybe the greatest mystery of all. Because if the Green Sahara was so open, if rivers braided the desert and lakes shimmered across the plains, then where was the traffic? The migrations? The mingling? For years, scientists assumed it had to be a corridor, a grand passage between North and Sub-Saharan Africa. The logic was simple. Water invites life. Movement. Exchange. But then the DNA arrived, and it told a very different story. Takarkori, 7,000 years ago. Green fields, scattered herds, thriving settlements. Yet in their genomes, silence. No Nilotic markers. No Sub-Saharan ancestry. Not even a faint signal from the Lake Chad Basin, where early Sahelian societies were already beginning to take shape. Their DNA wasn't just local, it was sealed, like a genetic firewall stretching across the desert. Even as cultural tools moved, pottery from the Nile, livestock from the Levant, the people didn't mix. Forensic genetics confirmed it. F4 statistics, principal component analysis, even admixture models all showed the same pattern. A total absence of south to north gene flow. And it gets stranger. Sites like Gobero in Niger, with over 80 burials across 5,000 years, also show no known sub-Saharan affinity in skeletal traits. No signs of deep genetic overlap, despite being closer to West Africa than to Libya. Despite shared environmental pressures. Despite 1,000 years of overlapping wet periods. It wasn't the landscape that stopped them. It was something else. A boundary not made of stone, but of belief, of identity. Perhaps spiritual, perhaps territorial, maybe linguistic. The Sahara, it turns out, wasn't a bridge. It was a filter, a place where objects could pass, but ancestry could not. A place where the body might stay pure, even as the mind absorbed foreign ways. And still their lineage didn't disappear. It didn't vanish with the desert winds, because somewhere, in the genes of people who never knew their names, echoes of these Saharan women still remain. And the first whisper of that connection comes from modern people whose DNA doesn't quite belong. That's where it starts. Researchers expected modern North African genomes to show a blend, some sub-Saharan ancestry from trans-Saharan trade, some Levantine influence from Neolithic farmers, maybe a touch of Europe from the coastal empires. But then, something strange surfaced. Buried beneath all the expected signals, there was a fragment. Old, silent, but still there. A genetic trace that didn't match Bantu expansions, or Arab conquests, or even the ancient Nile. It matched Takarkori. The Saharan ghost had returned. In 2025, when the Takarkori genomes were compared against present-day populations, one group stood out, the Amazigh, or Berber, peoples of the Maghreb, especially the Amazigh of Morocco and Algeria. Their DNA carried clear affinities to the Takarkori lineage. Not recent, ancestral. It was a match to a time before Neolithic agriculture, before Egypt, before history. And that wasn't the only surprise. The Fulani, semi-nomadic pastoralists who now stretch from Mali to Cameroon, also carried a trace. Small but consistent. A non-sub-Saharan component in their genome, best explained not by East Africa, but by something older. Something Saharan. And then culture stepped in. Across Fulani clans, certain burial traditions echo the Green Sahara, shallow graves, fetal positioning, animal bones placed with the dead. In Amazigh communities, body markings, ivory ornaments, and oral myths speak of ancestors who lived in a land of lakes. Not desert, lakes. The Fulani call themselves Bororoen in some dialects, meaning the cattle people. But the deeper etymology links to movement, herding, ancestry. And that ancestry, scientists now say, likely ties back to pastoral networks across the Sahara between 7,000 and 5,000 BC. This means the Green Sahara people didn't vanish. They were folded into time, buried beneath layers of conquest and climate, preserved not just in genes, but in ritual, in rhythm, and identity. Their voices didn't go silent, they just changed languages. And if the Takarkori genome survived in others, then maybe the Green Sahara was never just one lineage. Maybe it was a continent of forgotten branches. And somewhere, far from Libya, another is still waiting to be found. And if it exists, it may lie beneath the ancient sands of Gobero, northeastern Niger, the Tenere Desert. Today, it's one of the driest places on Earth, but 10,000 years ago, it was a lakeside Eden. And on its shores, humans lived, died, and buried their dead in ways so elaborate, it feels like poetry frozen in time. Archaeologists call it one of the richest prehistoric cemeteries in all of Africa. Over 180 individuals, thousands of artifacts, burial rituals more complex than Takarkori, and spread over 5 millennia. But not a single strand of DNA has survived. They call them the silent dead. Accordion Man, a towering skeleton, 9,500 years old, found in a fetal position with his arms bound tight. Turtle Man, buried 7,000 years ago, with a turtle shell placed beneath his hips, the only one of its kind ever found at the site. Pot Pillow Man, his skull gently cradled in a ceramic bowl, placed with intention, like a final gesture of comfort. Each body speaks of community, of memory, of symbolic life. And yet, they cannot speak genetically. Because unlike Takarkori's cool cave walls, Gobero's graves were shallow. The lake receded. The wind came. And over thousands of years, heat and humidity broke every nucleotide apart. Which leaves us with a haunting question. Were these people the same as the Takarkori women? Did they share ancestors, a Saharan superculture stretching from Libya to Niger? Or were they a separate lineage altogether? Another ghost population, completely lost to time? The bones don't tell us. Yet the clues keep circling. Their tools mirror those in Libya. Their burial styles echo across Sahelian traditions. But without DNA, every theory stands on fragile ground. Gobero could hold answers to one of the oldest mysteries in African human history. Or it could be a dead end. And there's something deeply human about that. The idea that an entire civilization, full of music, grief, and meaning, could vanish not in war, but in warmth. But maybe they're not gone. Maybe the next twist in this story isn't under our feet. Maybe it's still locked inside the blood of someone walking among us. unaware they carry the desert's last secret, and that secret might be hiding in plain sight, in the veins of millions. Because the DNA from Takarkori didn't just whisper from the past, it called out from the present. When researchers compared it to modern genomes, something remarkable appeared. The Amazigh, the Amazigh peoples of North Africa, held fragments of it, not borrowed, not diluted beyond recognition, but layered deep, like a foundation no empire ever erased. Today, Amazigh populations in Morocco, Algeria, and the Atlas Mountains show genetic components older than the Neolithic, older than Pharaonic Egypt, older than the Sahara's first drought. Traces that connect not to Europe, not to sub-Saharan Africa, but to the Takarkori women. The same branch, the same mitochondrial echoes, a line unbroken for over 7,000 years. It flips everything we thought we knew. North Africa, long seen as a crossroads, where people blended, empires clashed, languages mixed, may have started not as a melting pot, but as a locked vault. One of the most striking revelations? The Tafril people, buried in Morocco 15,000 years ago, already showed signs of this Saharan lineage. The genetic drift between Tafril and Takarkori isn't wide. They were cousins, separated by land, not by blood. And modern North Africans? Their gene pool is like sediment. The Takarkori layer sits at the bottom. Then come Levantine farmers, Arab traders, European colonists. But none replaced the base. It survived every migration, every empire, every drought. That's the twist. North Africa wasn't built by newcomers. It was fortified by deep time, by people who didn't move, but endured. And today, when an Amazigh child is born in the Rift Mountains, or a Fulani herder sings a cattle song in the Sahel, a part of Takarkori still lives. This isn't a heritage you learn from a textbook. It's ancestry you feel, in skin, in story, in silence. But there's a challenge buried in all of this. 2 ancient genomes, a forgotten population. Can that really be enough to rewrite 50,000 years of human history? 2 women, from one cave, in one stretch of desert no one had searched deeply enough until now. And yet, their DNA cracked open a story buried longer than any monument, longer than the pyramids, longer than writing. In just a few sequences of nucleotides, our entire map of African ancestry shifted. These weren't migrants. They weren't traders. They weren't even part of a known population. They were themselves. Something ancient, something local, something no textbook had room for. And what haunts researchers isn't just what we found, but what we haven't. Because if one cave, Takarkori, can reveal an entire forgotten branch of human lineage, what could still lie under the sands of Fezzan, or Tenera, or Enedi? The Sahara once stretched green from the Red Sea to the Atlantic. Millions could have lived here between 10,000 and 5,000 BC. Fishers, herders, painters, poets. We know this from the art. Over 100,000 images carved and painted across the desert's rock shelters. Boats, cattle, ceremonies. But we don't know the names they spoke, the gods they prayed to, or the songs they sang when the rains finally came. Language, memory, bloodlines, all erased. Except not entirely. Because in those 2 women, their skin preserved by desert heat, their genomes decoded by 21st century tech, something resisted erasure, a fragment of the human story that chose to endure. So this was never just about Libya, or the Amazigh, or even Africa. It's about how fragile and powerful ancestry truly is, how it only takes one sample to break open an entire continent's forgotten past. But the Sahara isn't done talking. Because geologists know, under those dunes lie entire riverbeds, fossil lakes, buried settlements, some still untouched since the day they were abandoned. And somewhere, someone else is waiting. A child, a chieftain, a buried ancestor whose blood might redraw the map one more time. Because if a forgotten genome can change everything we thought we knew, then ask yourself this. What part of your story is still missing?